And we are live. It's Dr. Justin Marchegiani in the house with Dr. Rawls. We have an exciting interview. We're going to be talking about co-infections. We're going to be talking about fibromyalgia. We'll be talking with Dr. Rawls here about, formulating supplements, some of his favorite herbs to address co-infections, as well as real live clinical experience. I'm really excited to have Dr. Rawls on the podcast. Doc, how are we doing this morning?
Oh, wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. Awesome. So, how did you get into this field? Because obviously you were trained as a conventional medical doctor and you've had to go from medical school and get all this experience about things on the functional integrative medicine side. How did you make that journey from conventional medical doctor to more holistic functional medical doctor?
Yeah, sometimes life forces you into things that you're not expecting.
Hmm.
I actually went into OBGYN as my specialty
Wow.
because it dealt with wellness and was not heavily em- embroiled in medications. So it was definitely more active, but it came with really bad night call and bad health habits, bad night call. My health crashed by the time I was at the end of my 40s.
Wow.
Call it fibromyalgia. Later, I found out I was carrying the microbes that come with Lyme disease. And my conventional colleagues couldn't help me. They couldn't figure it out. And so I turned away from conventional medicine, became certified in holistic medicine, but found my real salvation with herbal therapy and ultimately got my life back. And now at age 62, I'm better health than most people.
Wow. That's excellent. That's really good. So I know you kind of have a lot of specific herbal formulas that you've created. You're over at rawlsmd.com, vitalplan.com as well. And some of your herbs I find very interesting. Can you kind of talk about why you've chose some of the herbs that you have and just some of your favorite clinically, as well as, personally, because I think you have a story with some of these as well. Can you touch upon that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, there are a lot of herbs out there that I think have value for Lyme disease and really any kind of medical condition, especially chronic conditions. And even I think there's some applications to things like COVID so
Yes.
that are important. Herbs have antimicrobial properties because if you look at what the herb is, it's plant chemicals, what we call phytochemicals. So all plants are producing a wide spectrum of chemicals to protect themselves from various kinds of microbes, insects, free radicals, everything else. So when we take in that phytochemistry of the plant, and it's especially intense in wild plants that we call herbs, we gain those benefits. We're basically embracing the natural defenses. Where it differs between plants is evolution. One plant that evolves in one place will have a different spectrum of phytochemicals than another plant that evolves in another place. So like rhodiola, which is a really nice adaptogen, it helps you adapt to
Yes.
stress, is grows in really harsh northern climates. So it's not as much producing antimicrobials, but it produces chemicals that help resist stress because that's what the plant's having to deal with. Whereas cat's claw from the Amazon, wow, it's having to deal with a lot of microbes, so it's producing a lot of antimicrobials. So in our formulas, I typically use a balance, and I think this is really, really important. The antimicrobial herbs like cat's claw, another one that I like is andrographis,
Hmm.
Japanese knotweed, garlic. If you use a stabilized extract, cryptolepis is another one. So
Yep.
there's really a nice list of antimicrobial herbs. And these herbs have direct antiviral, antibacterial properties. In fact, some of those herbs, there was actually a study out of Johns Hopkins recently that showed some of these herbs had better antimicrobial properties than antibiotics did, which
Hmm.
is really cool. But you're not getting just those antimicrobial properties. You're getting things that also stimulate the immune system and drive things. But you can make the immune system too hot. You can drive it too hard. So I typically balance it with what we call immune modulating herbs like reishi mushroom,
Hmm.
um, and cordyceps, and salvia miltiorrhiza, which is a species of red sage.
Okay.
And so these things balance the immune system and keep it from getting too hot. And that combination together, along with other supportive ingredients like glutathione,
Yep.
can really do wonders for a lot of different conditions.
Now, I find a lot of medical doctors that kind of jump on the functional medicine or like the co-infection Lyme bandwagon. A lot of them go really heavy on antibiotics. And I notice you haven't really taken that path. Have you evolved to this position? Were you more on the antibiotic path? Is there a place for antibiotics? It seems like you lean more to the herbs because it's of the immune building qualities, the immune modulation, the viral replication, a little bit more supportive than killing. What's your take on the strategy that you've chosen versus some of the antibiotics?
Yeah, it again, fate drives where you go in life so
Yeah.
much. And I'd struggled with fibromyalgia for years, and to get over that, I started changing my diet, doing better health habits, etc. Started doing some herbs, but then I found out that I had the microbes with Lyme, so I immediately jumped on antibiotics, and they made me much sicker very
Mm.
rapidly. So I really was forced in this other direction of herbal therapy. And it was really years before I started figuring out, well, why, what's going
Hmm.
on here. I just said there's a study from John Hopkins showing that some of these herbs work better than antibiotics.
Hmm.
So why are antibiotics such a problem? The problem with antibiotics is they're indiscriminate. They target
Hmm.
specific microbes, and they're very intense. So what happens when you use an antibiotic is you start a race. As soon as you start that antibiotic, it's like, will I kill off the microbe I'm targeting before I kill off all my normal flora and destroy my gut and my system,
Right.
which trashes my immune system even worse. So when you look at acute infections, an acute pneumonia, acute Lyme disease, antibiotics are effective because they knock down the numbers. But this thing that antibiotics eradicate microbes is an absolute myth. There is no
Hmm.
antibiotic on earth that will completely eradicate a pathogen. It's always up to the immune system. And a good example of that is if you've got an elderly person or someone with AIDS that has no immune system left and they get something like a pneumonia, it doesn't matter how much antibiotic you give them, then they are going to die. And that's all there
Right.
is to it.
I
So,
find that to be 100% true where antibiotics may be better for more acute infection, but like you
yep,
said, I think combining the herbs along with it or right after it just because of the immune building effects. There's also a lot of data on the fact that antibiotics can create a lot of mitochondrial damage and oxidative stress. The nice
absolutely.
and the nice thing about Mother Nature's antibiotics, they tend to be packaged with a whole bunch of antioxidants as well, and actually nutrition in a lot of cases, right? Some herbs actually have extra nutrients like magnesium or zinc and such, and can help support the body on the nutritional side as well. And I imagine when you're seeing a person and they have co-infections, you may be using other nutrients along with the herbs. I think you already just alluded to glutathione. What other nutrients do you like to stack in there to really work on building up that patient's immune response?
Sure. Well, just to finish it up on the herbs,
Yes.
when you look at that complex phytochemistry of the herb, you've got to think about the fact that the plant, it has to kill off the pathogens and not destroy its own normal flora. So
Yes.
one interesting factor that I found with herbs is herbs tend to balance the microbiome. They don't kill the normal flora like antibiotics do. So you can use them long term for years and years and years without having bacterial resistance and without disrupting normal flora. So that makes them a really, really useful tool. So in our regiments, we use primarily herbs, but there are some other nutrients that I found to be valuable.
Hmm.
Glutathione is top of the list. NAC
Hmm.
is a good one. N-acetylcysteine,
Yep.
it has a lot of value. Basic vitamins can be beneficial,
Hmm.
but using the natural forms of the vitamins
Hmm.
like the natural folates instead of folic
Hmm.
acid,
Correct.
some basic minerals. Those things are most important for someone who's struggling with chronic illness, though, and may not be absorbing those nutrients. For healthy people, they don't need those nutrients as much.
Hmm.
But struggling with chronic illness, I think they can be very important in that recovery process.
Very interesting. And when you source the herbs, how important is the quality? Because I imagine, just like we go out and we can buy meat from McDonald's, we can also buy the grass-fed organic
Yeah.
meat from the butcher or the local farmer down the street. How important is quality when you're sourcing supplements? Because I mean, you're manufacturing your product, so you're choosing the raw material that you're buying.
Yeah, everything, and if I could do it, I would grow everything myself and process it all the way through, but it's not practical because what you find is, like I said, rhodiola grows in Arctic regions
Mm,
where cat's claw grows in the Amazon. So if you want to get that full spectrum, you're going to have to get different herbs from different places.
mm,
Um, so it is really a matter of the trustworthiness of the company and whether they're doing the things that they need to do, and that tends to cost more. I have a supply chain manager that he and I work together sourcing herbs, and we're looking for the suppliers that we can trace it back to the farm, that we can, we know that this particular farm is doing the right things to potentiate the value of the phytochemistry of the herb. And we know that because we do testing.
mhm.
So some of it is third-party testing that the supplier does, that you get a certificate of analysis that defines it is the species that you're looking for, that it has that phytochemistry that you're looking for, and it doesn't contain chemical contaminants like heavy metals
Mhm.
and organic toxins. But we don't stop there. We actually take a sample of that extract that's coming from that supplier, and we have it independently tested to make sure that that's the truth. And then we actually test 3 times during the manufacturing process to make sure that everything is being mixed properly and that our customers are getting what they want, and that we're going to have something that actually works. And that is the thing that that's the real proof in the pudding, is that the products work, and we've had great success with them.
Very good. Yeah, because I know, like, I've seen like supplements in Walgreens and CVS. I manufacture my supplements too, and I see things on the shelf. I'm like, that product is too cheap. I know if I buy
Yeah.
kilograms of that raw material at a bulk rate, not even encapsulating or testing it, it's costing more than what's on the shelf. So I know there's definitely a quality impact, and people tend to look at and price shop, but quality supplements definitely cost a lot more. You get what you pay for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Yep, yep, no doubt. And it's worth to put the money in something that has the value, that does have those credentials behind it.
Absolutely. Now, I know you had a personal health journey you kind of mentioned with certain co-infection and fibromyalgia. Which specific herbs or nutrients really moved the needle for you that helped you get over some of the infections you were dealing with personally?
Yeah. Um, that's where I think about Lyme disease, I think a little bit differently
Hmm.
than a lot of other practitioners out there, in that I feel like more than anything else, what we've got here is an insult to the immune system.
Hmm.
And that is driving the whole thing. So when we look at these things that we define as co-infections, Borrelia, and all the different species of microbes, most of these things are not highly virulent. They don't have a high propensity to cause disease. Like me, I probably had been carrying these things in my body for years and years. It wasn't until I trashed my immune system that I got sick. So when you look at this concept of microbiome in the body, we all have pathogens. We're riddled with
Yes.
pathogens. And if you pick up certain things from ticks, then you're going to increase your risk of chronic illness. But that's not going to happen unless you actually trash your immune system. So whether you're talking about Babesia or different species of Rickettsia or Borrelia or anything else, All of these things are commonly carried, harbored by people that do not become ill ever. So typically when I've seen patients with the chronic illness, what we call chronic Lyme disease, typically they all have a story. You know, you can trace it back to a perfect storm of factors. It's not, you know, so most people, it's not like, well, I remember the tick bite and I got sick right after the tick bite. When I go back and ask that history, it's more that, oh yeah, you know, my house burned down, my business
Mm,
collapsed, my wife left, and I had all this stress, and that's when I became ill.
mm.
So I think when we're looking at this concept, we're talking about all of the different pathogens in the body start becoming active because the immune system has been suppressed, and it becomes a vicious cycle. So we have these things throughout our body.
I imagine with yourself, you could probably trace it back to residency and years of being on call. And maybe, you know, I know medical school, there's not really much education on nutrition. So maybe your nutrition wasn't the tip top at that time. Would that kind of be the sequence for you if you were to go back in time with that stress?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You know, I was more, I think, enlightened. I was trying to do the right thing back in the 80s as far as nutrition, but
Hmm.
we were getting bad information. You know, it was like, oh, you got to eat all this whole grain. That's what
Yeah.
you got to do.
And then you
Whole
got to
grain
avoid
bread,
fats
whole
too, right?
grain this,
Everything's low
whole
fat.
grain that.
Yeah.
And you know, so it wasn't until later when I started to question those things, and I was well off gluten before the gluten-free craze came along.
Ah, smart.
But yeah, you know, I promoted good health practices in my practice, but you take call every second to third night that you don't sleep.
Wow.
And then back in the 80s, it was good. People were questioning the value of, well, do we really need to sleep? So I bought into that. So yeah. So when I wasn't on call, it's like I was going to make up for all the time I was on call by not sleeping. And I, you know, I was averaging maybe 4 hours of sleep most nights.
Oof.
And it caught up with me, along with just pushing that stress button way too hard and eating on the run. Even though I was telling people how to eat, I wasn't doing it because I didn't have time.
So when you start with a patient, right, what are some of the simple diet and lifestyle changes that you're making? It sounds like you're having cut out gluten, which I find to be a huge game changer for me. I kind of lean onto a paleo template, and then we kind of adjust macros and such. And some people, you know, have autoimmune; they need to cut out more foods. Some have a lot of SIBO, and maybe even need to do, you know, more restrictive things like FODMAP. But what are some of the foundational things that you do diet wise starting out? And it sounds like you kind of set the foundation first, and then do some of the other immune killing stuff maybe later on when they're more supported. Is that right?
Yeah, we do have in the protocols that we do, we have a diet, a progressive diet program that's in phases. It's probably a lot like what you're doing.
Hmm.
But it's just getting people off processed food. So when it comes to diet, I have three primary rules that I follow for myself. One, eat more vegetables than anything else.
Hmm. Hmm.
By the end of the day, you should have eaten more vegetables than any other thing.
Solid.
Number two is eat fresh food that comes from living sources,
Hmm.
which I think is really important. And that cuts out most of the processed food. And number three, don't eat any more calories than you need in a day. And if you do those things, if you can find a way, it doesn't matter whether you're a vegetarian or eat meat or have some carbohydrates or eat some grains. You know, if you're doing those basic things, you're probably going to gravitate toward a healthier diet. But the big thing for me that I did years and years ago and lost 30 pounds pretty quickly in the process was just giving up bread and things made with flour.
Hmm.
That single thing was huge.
Hmm. Hmm. And then when you're seeing people with I think it's, you know, solid information. Like I always tell patients, start with the low hanging fruit because one, you're increasing nutrients on one side, and two, those are they're suppressing your immune system. So you get a double whammy there. You support the nutrients that support the immune system, and then you decrease the stressors. So it allows that to come up a lot faster and better. How are you assessing Lyme? How are you assessing these co-infections? Do you do any specific testing? Are you using symptom survey? Do you do any energetic muscle testing? What's your perspective on assessing?
Um, you know, when I did a medical practice, I did a lot of different kinds of testing. I went through a
Hmm.
phase where I was doing just tons and tons of functional medicine testing.
Hmm.
And as I went through time, I found that I used those things less and less and found less value in them because I could learn so much just by talking to the patients. And I think that's what so many doctors, especially conventional doctors, don't do, is there's really no rewards in our system for talking to patients. And that's where you really learn the information. But when we look at this thing we call chronic Lyme disease, I see most illness as more of a continuum with chronic immune dysfunction right in the center of it.
Hmm.
So I think there are people out there that have all the symptoms of chronic Lyme disease that aren't carrying Borrelia, but they are carrying other microbes like Borrelia and they have immune
Hmm.
dysfunction. So it's basically all the same symptomatology, even technically they don't have Lyme disease. And when you look at that concept of this disruption of the microbiome and picking up all of these opportunistic microbes as we do through life, because we do, we pick up Bartonella from pets, we pick up
Yep.
mycoplasma, we pick up chlamydia. So these are non-tick-borne things that all of us pick up that can cause the same symptoms. But about a year or two ago, I sat down and researched all the microbes that I could find that had the characteristics that we call stealth microbes, that they live inside cells, they manipulate the immune system, they tend to just have a presence deep in tissue inside cells. And I found well over 100 species of microbes that have the potential to be involved with this kind of chronic illness, but can also be present in the body without causing illness. So there are a lot of potential things out there. So everything we're touching, the things that we're testing for, just really it's a drop in the bucket. We're barely scratching the surface. And that's the cool thing when you use comprehensive herbal therapy, you're addressing all of these different things. So it often doesn't matter as much. So I tend to use testing when people aren't getting well. We
Hmm.
put them on a basic protocol, change their diet, change their approach to life, put them on a regimen of herbs. And then if they're not getting well, that's an indication that to seek out different kinds of testing. But most of the time, 50% of the time or more, they won't need it.
That's great. In my practice, clinically, we set the foundation. We work a lot with, adrenal stress because the adrenals kind of are the big interplay with that sympathetic nervous system. So a lot of times we see cortisol imbalances or cortisol rhythm issues, usually from HPA axis disruption. So we fix the stress, we fix the diet, really support the hormones. And you mentioned like rhodiola as being one, a big fan of those adaptogens, and that really supports the immune system. I find addressing a lot of stealth gut infections, I tend to prioritize that first because I know 80% of the immune system's in the gut. So if someone has H. pylori or SIBO or maybe a Giardia infection, I clinically find knocking that down. One, it helps them digest their food better, so they're getting more nutrition from their food. But two, these infections aren't there. They aren't creating gut permeability. They aren't creating as much inflammation. What's your take on gut infections, and how do you sequence addressing gut infections in relation to like Lyme co-infections?
Yeah. You're right. A significant portion of the immune system is surrounding the gut because the gut has so many challenges.
Hmm.
We've got so much stuff coming through our gut. We're feeding all of those microbes, and if you're eating bad food, you're feeding bad microbes.
Hmm.
And those
Hmm.
microbes are very active as far as neurotransmitters they produce that affect our system and damage to the colon itself. So you end up with leaky gut, which I did. I did food sensitivity testing when I was in the throes of everything, and I was sensitive to 75% of the
Wow.
foods that I was eating. And it was and you see that commonly with leaky gut. So once the gut is
Yep.
damaged, you get proteins that are flooding across. So a lot of times, well, I didn't know whether it was the microbes causing the symptoms or the food sensitivities causing the symptoms. And a lot of times it's both. So yes, addressing that gut dysfunction is really important. Diet is the first step, of course,
Yep.
because what you feed your microbes is so remarkably important. Some people find value with probiotics. I think it's kind of hit or miss.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're still learning with probiotics. But the thing that I found that addressed those kinds of problems more than anything else with the herbs again, especially herbs like berberine and berberine containing herbs, and others that support the gut. Slippery elm is really good for protecting the gut and allowing it to heal. But the other herbs that I mentioned also have some benefits to the gut too. So the herbs tend to suppress the bad microbes, suppress the bad microbes in the gut that are causing the SIBO, suppress Candida. And then if you're getting people on good foods that are cultivating that normal healthy flora, then you'll get there. The struggle for a lot of people though is our standard American diet is so bad, and that's what people have been used to since they were children. It's really, really hard to move them over to a good diet. It's a very gradual process. So we start out with a pretty strict diet that we use foods that don't typically cause food sensitivities, that cultivate good gut flora, and move people to a better place beyond that.
That's great. I know some of the herbs that, one of your famous product, Advanced Biotic, you have the Japanese knotweed, the cat's claw, the andrographis, the sarsaparilla, which are great for some of these co-infections. Do you have any favorite specific herbs that you like for just general parasite cleansing, or just some of the herbs you've had really good success with clinically?
Well, all of these things have parasite capabilities.
Hmm.
Cat's claw and andrographis
Hmm.
have been traditionally used. Going beyond that, for people that feel like they need a parasite. So
Hmm.
defining parasite, we're generally talking about intestinal worms, which are
Hmm.
multicellular organisms. Um, and the classic combination is artemisia or wormwood
Hmm.
and black walnut and
Hmm.
clove. And those are pretty strong herbs, so I don't typically use them long term. Not everybody will need that, though. I
Hmm.
mean, it's the difference between what we call parasites that are multicellular organisms and the microbes that are in our body, which are single cell organisms, protozoa, bacteria, viruses, etc. All of the microbes can reproduce within the body, whereas multicellular organisms cannot. The only way that you can get intestinal worms is ingesting either eggs or larvae. So you have to have that constant reinoculation. These things are not breeding inside your body. So once they die off, they're gone. And the only way to perpetuate those things is to keep reinoculating yourself,
And how do you
which is
categorize amoebas like blasto or like entamoeba histolytica or endolimex? How do you
those
categorize
are
those
single cell.
parasites?
They can reproduce in the body, but
Hmm.
so some of those things are common, and they
Mm.
can take up residence and hang around for a long time. But your typical worms do not. So
Mm.
most people in this country don't have a big load of worms because we don't have contamination of our food, typically with eggs or larva, which comes from fecal contamination. It's really
Hmm.
common in
Hmm.
third world countries, but we don't carry as much of an intestinal burden, probably less than humans have ever carried in this country. It's pretty much been endemic through human history because of fecal contamination of food. And again, it's still really common in third world countries, but not as common here. So I find that just most of the standard herbs with the andrographis and cat's claw and those kinds of things will gradually take care of those problems. But then for people who feel like they have giardia or amoeba or other kinds of things that they picked up, which do happen, that artemisia, clove, black walnut combination is great. And there are other ones that are good too. I mean, that's a nice thing about herbs. There's so many choices.
That's very cool. Now, clinically, is there any like low hanging fruit? Like it's underrated. People don't really think about it as like a big clinical mover, but for you, it's been a big clinical success in your practice. You use it a lot, but it may not be well known. Any like, is there one or two big clinical pearls that kind of come to the tip of your head?
Um, hmm. Well, probably just herbal therapy in
Hmm.
general.
Hmm.
I mean, I think that has more healing value than anything else out there. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And it's just it's that different approach. So much of what we do and how I was trained as a conventional doctor is you take the patient, you collect the symptoms, you do a physical exam, you do labs to find the diagnosis, and you treat the diagnosis with drugs or whatever. But what I started doing after my life changed by by uh, chronic illness was working backwards to, instead of asking the patient asking how a patient is ill, ask why is this patient
Hmm.
ill. And so in my protocols I always step back to look at the patient's life. What are they eating, how are they
So
stressed,
important.
what kind of exposure to microbes did they have, what kind of exposure to toxins, that list, and going down that list. And I always found answers, and most of the time I could help a patient well before we even got to the point of finding the diagnosis.
I agree. I think a timeline history is so important. When I interview patients, I like to find out, hey, when did things first start to go sideways? What was going on? And then what happened 5 years later after you move? What happened after the divorce? I like to really understand with that timeline these stressors and how did it impact you? Did you ever come back from it? Did you resolve it? Where are you at now? I think that's really important because the history, I think, a good doctor will tell you history reveals a lot. I think that's powerful. Next up, any thoughts on this whole COVID crisis? I mean, we can go into it from, just your medical perspective, being a medical doctor, as well as, what are things you're doing to help protect you and your patients just to keep your immune system strong?
Yeah, that's we could have a whole another big
Yeah.
conversation on COVID, and I've followed it from the beginning, and it's it's quite an enigma. The thing about this coronavirus that makes it very frustrating is that most people don't get very sick. It's not
Hmm.
nearly as virulent as I think everybody thought in the beginning. And typically, that concept of virulence is important. If something is very highly virulent, then most people will get sick, and you can identify the people that are sick very readily, and you can quarantine them. That's why quarantine works so well for something like Ebola virus. That's why quarantine worked with the previous SARS and MERS outbreaks, because
Yep.
those microbes were much more virulent. They made people sick, so you could identify the people that were sick and quarantine them and contain it. This thing isn't nearly as virulent. It's looking at, as they're coming out with serology, it's looking like the mortality associated with this virus is closer to influenza, maybe even less than
Yep.
influenza.
I've seen that.
And half of people barely get sick at all, may not even have the symptoms of a common cold. So it is very, very difficult to control it. So, whereas I think isolation was a good idea in the beginning to let the hospitals catch up with supplies and everything else, because some people do get really, really sick with this thing, um, then I think that was a good idea. But I think as we go through time, it's going to become less and less and less valuable because it's just going to destroy the economy. But what I don't hear, and what I'm really, really frustrated about,
Hmm.
is when I listen to the news, when I listen to the medical establishment, I am hearing the latest statistics and what drug they're looking for, all of which have really bad side effects,
Hmm.
and when we're going to get a vaccine so we can actually control this thing, and absolutely nothing about immune health. Nobody is
No one.
promoting the importance of
Nope.
immune health. And what I can tell you is the people that keep their immune system healthy have a much, much, much lower chance of ending up in the hospital and dying from this thing. And we're just not hearing anything about that. And we do know something about some of the herbs. Some of the things that are already out there have been found to have activity against previous coronaviruses. So Japanese knotweed, Chinese skullcap, some of the things that we're actually using for Lyme actually have good value, have been shown to be effective for coronavirus. Glutathione has been shown to reduce the severity of the illness. Ginger, good old ginger tea, has been shown to
Love ginger.
decrease the potential for these viruses to bind to the respiratory tract. So
Yes.
you've got all these, and vitamin C. Vitamin C is extraordinary. Zinc. So we have all these natural things, and we're hearing nothing about them. In fact, they're even being demonized by some people as, oh, we don't know anything about that because nobody studied it yet. But and this knee-jerk thing to incriminate natural therapy as being non-effective, even though there's evidence to the contrary and nobody's looking at it. So I've found that to be hugely frustrating.
I 100% echo those sentiments. I think we are playing a defensive approach, washing hands, social distancing. I think we kind of know intuitively to stay away from people that are sick, right? And, hey, we can learn to wash our hands. That makes sense. But we need a good offense, right? And the offense, like you mentioned, are some of those essential nutrients. Like I've been recommending ginger tea for over a decade. I mean, like you mentioned, the
Yeah.
viral replication aspect, preventing the virus from sticking on, in this case, that ACE2 receptor site. You also mentioned the lethality aspects, and I've been talking about this quite frequently. And the data coming out of studies out of MIT, USC, Stanford. So when you calculate, mortality rate for people listening at home, right? You take the numerator, which is how many people died, and then you put it over the denominator, how many cases they are. The problem is there's about 25 to 50 times more people that are
Right.
part of that denominator that we don't even know about. So then when you add the 25 to 50, then that makes that death rate a lot lower. Number two, if there's 25 to 50 times more people, now we got a lot more herd immunity out there, which is preventing that infection from being passed around, which I think is vitally, vitally important. And the third issue I have is, I don't know, you can tell me, Doc, because you're in the medical, scene more. They created two diagnostic codes for this infection, UO7.1, UO7.2. UO7.1 is an objective diagnosis with the PCR testing. UO7.2 is an epidemiological diagnosis that does not require any objective testing. If you have any upper respiratory tract symptoms and you die, you can be classified as UO7.2. Totally subjective. Do you know any other diseases that have two diagnostic criterias and one that's totally subjective?
Well, yeah, the whole coding system
Is
is
the
a
flu like
mess.
that? Is the flu like that at all?
No, I'm not sure about the flu, but I tell you, yeah, the whole coding system is a mess, and I think you and I are right on the same wavelength with that one. When I started hearing, I mean, being really immersed in this concept of microbes for the past 20 years, and just that concept of virulence has been very, very important to me, that I don't think a lot of doctors, including many infectious disease experts, really don't understand the concept of virulence and how important it is, and how these microbes function. But when I first started hearing the reports out of Wuhan, China, they were saying, okay, the mortality that is 2.5%. So it's like, okay, well, right up front, that's a whole lot less than SARS, which was 10%. So
Right.
we're dealing with something that's very much less virulent. And then they were saying, well, 80% of people will not need medical care, and that the testing that they were doing, it was not widely available. So right up front, I'm going, okay, let's put two and two together here. We've got a stated mortality of 2.5% that of the cases they know about, but probably at least 50% of the mild cases aren't being reported at all,
Yep.
and they don't know about them. That means the actual mortality is probably around 0.5% or lower. And now that we're getting around to doing serology testing, that's about where it is. Not to say this isn't a serious illness, and yes, people are dying from it. And I'm not suggesting that we should be complacent about that. But I do think that we should be, like you said, more on the offense of doing things to
Yep.
protect our elderly, people that have immune compromise, everybody doing things to protect their immune system, herbs, better diet, sleep, everything. Social distancing is very reasonable. But I think that people aren't approaching this thing from a common sense point of view.
I agree. And I'm going to be doing a video on this later on today. I got some of the data from Italy, which they're about, 2, 3 weeks ahead of us on this whole situation. But the data showed about out of all the people that passed from the infection, 61% had 3 or more comorbidities,
Right.
and over 90% had at least one comorbidity.
Yeah.
And the average age of death was in 90 or 81. So that's,
Yeah.
I mean, I look at that, and you got to say, should the whole, working age, economy be shut down, or should we have a more of a strategic way of quarantining people like Sweden and maybe Brazil? That's number one. And then the second component I would say on top of that is the COVID-19 or the coronavirus tends to not be doing as well with people that are put on ventilators. About 10%
Yeah.
survive. So there's something different with the ventilators with corona versus the flu. Do you have any? I have some thoughts on that. Do you have any takes on that?
Well, I think anytime somebody ends up on a ventilator anyway, it's
It's
bad
always low.
news.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, their whole system is struggling, and their lungs are full of fluid. But ventilators in general are just really, really hard on the body. And it's anybody that ends up in an ICU and a ventilator for anything is going to have a very long recovery if they survive it. It's unless it's for like a post-operative procedure or something like that, where you
Hmm.
started with a person who was healthy in the beginning. But yeah, this virus does seem to act differently than influenza. It affects cells differently. It has a modus operandi that's different than influenza. But as you mentioned earlier, though, I think there are an awful lot of cases of probably influenza that got bundled under
Yep.
COVID too. And there could have been some cross infections that people had both influenza and COVID. Because when you look at this thing, there have been like millions and millions of cases, like 50 million cases of influenza since October, and the death rate from influenza the last time I looked was 57,000 people in the United States, and this is for a virus that we have a vaccine for. It's just that the vaccine doesn't work a lot of the time. The people that are dying are the people that don't have a healthy immune systems that get trashed with the thing. So it's been kind of crazy, that we've got all these spotlights focused on this person in an ICU bed that's struggling for COVID, and if you shine the camera down the way, you'd probably find 6 others that were struggling with influenza. So we've just, it's been such a visible thing, and then neglecting some other things out there too.
I totally agree. And just so your strategy, you're adding in extra ginger. I like that. I think you said vitamin C and vitamin A. Were there any specific things? I think also NAC has been a big one with viral replication and keeping mucus and inflammation in the lungs down and helping those redox pathways in the lungs. Is there anything else you want to highlight that you're doing for an offensive approach outside of just washing your hands and staying away from people?
Well, what I've been doing is, taking immune modulating herbs, and
Mhm.
I think this is something, looking at COVID. One of the things that the virus does do is the immune reaction to it can be severe, and it creates a cytokine storm
Yep.
that can be very damaging. And there has been evidence that some stimulating antimicrobial herbs like echinacea, um, and astragalus can actually enhance that cytokine storm because they're heating things up.
Mhm.
So I think the immune modulating herbs are really important. I take reishi, cordyceps, but I also take some antimicrobials that aren't quite so hot.
Hmm.
Our product with andrographis, Japanese knotweed, and we have Chinese skullcap. Those are all things that have been found to be active.
That's
And
the
I'm
advanced
taking
biotic.
pretty much a standard dose of those things regularly. We have a product with glutathione and NAC. I think glutathione
Hmm.
is just as valuable. Something that you just pick up little bits of information. We get our glutathione from a company called Cetria, and I spoke to the medical director when we were deciding on that as an ingredient. Um, and he said, I've been working with a group of high school cystic fibrosis kids. And cystic fibrosis is an excess of mucus in the lungs, and there's a glutathione mechanism behind that. And he said, I've got them on this product and they're living normal lives. And it just stuck with me. So the glutathione, NAC, both have some wonderful mucolytic properties and some supportive
Yep.
health promoting properties in the lungs. Vitamin C, another study from years ago, medical school, that really hit home is, humans and primates are the only creatures that don't produce vitamin C.
Hmm.
All other creatures do. And there was an experiment where they took rats, and they took the rats and they just tested them in a non-stressed situation, and they were producing about the equivalent of us taking 200 to 500 milligrams of vitamin C a day. So they stressed these rats and then measured how much vitamin C they were putting out, and it was the equivalent of us taking 21,000 milligrams a day.
Wow. Wow.
So it just shows that when we're stressed, we burn up a lot of vitamin C and we use it. So
Wow.
I've been taking extra each day, but whenever I get sick with a cold or a flu, I take about 1,000 milligrams an hour, up to about 6 hours. So I'm taking anywhere from 3 to 6,000 milligrams a day. I've heard stories of some places doing 16,000. I typically use the buffered vitamin C, the ester
Yep.
C.
Yep.
Take a little bit of zinc with that and the herbs, and drink a lot of ginger tea these days.
Yep.
I'm following good social isolation practices. Most of my work is from home now, so I'm using good common sense. I'm definitely not being cavalier. I don't want COVID or anything else. But I was doing that before. I'm pretty careful about these things as it was, and I'm doing everything I can to keep my immune system healthy. And those things are just really critical, whether you're
Yeah.
talking about COVID or anything else.
I know. Well, the interesting thing is, 20 years ago, if you were in your OB practice right now, you'd be shut down, but you're still able to help people, and I'm still able to help people with the whole virtual environment we have right now. So we're really benefiting from the technology and the times we live in.
Yeah, for
Excellent.
sure.
Well, doctor, is there anything else you want to leave us with? I'm going to let the listeners know Dr. Rawls' website is rawlsmd.com, RAWLSMD.com. We're going to put the links down below. Dr. Rawls' supplement site is vitalplan.com. We'll put the links down below. And then my favorite product that he has is the Advanced Biotic. We'll put that down below. Doc, you also have a book coming out, so I'd love to have you come back on the podcast when that book comes out and we can chat about that. Is there anything else you want to leave the listeners here today?
Well, I do have a book called Unlocking Lyme that after
Yep.
I took a year off of my life and wrote a book, just that everything that I'd learned about Lyme disease, and that's out there, and I think a lot of people have found that valuable. Right now, I'm working on a book about healthy aging and how important this concept of microbes and the microbiome and immune system is in the healthy aging process, or the aging process, and just staying healthy as you age. So hopefully in some months, 3 months, 6 months, we'll have all that done and out there. But thanks for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Dr. Ross. We'll put all the links that you mentioned down below and love to have you back in the next few months when that book wraps up. It was excellent chatting with you. You have a phenomenal day and you stay healthy.
Awesome. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Bye now.